to another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show and supporting the station. You can also download the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to leave a question about the show or previous shows, you can send an email to comment@am950radio.com. All right, so for today's show, I want to talk first about Republican policies, and also the question for this segment is like, why do people vote for Republicans? I mean, if you actually look at the policies that they pass and how they harm people, you really got to question, why do people vote for Republicans? I'm sure there's other reasons why they do it, mainly cultural issues, probably. But when you look at like economics and how people are affected by their policies, you really have to wonder. So hopefully, this midterm election, people will start thinking about, maybe it's time to, if you're a Republican, to give the Democrats a shot at least. So, first example of this is from the state of Oklahoma. On the ballot was raising their minimum wage. So Oklahoma is one of those states that their state minimum wage is set to whatever the federal minimum wage is, which is right now that's $7.25 an hour. When minimum wage was first set in the 30s during the Depression, it was 25 cents an hour. In over 80 some years now, it's only gone up $7 since that time. So, Oklahoma is a state where if you get enough signatures on a ballot measure, you can have the people of the state vote on, whatever that is. So the people in Oklahoma were able to do that. Back in 2024 is when they got enough signatures. And of course, the Republicans and the business class in Oklahoma didn't like this idea, so they sued. And the Supreme Court in the state of Oklahoma, because this is, again, a state issue, they said, no, this is legal. You can go ahead and do it. But the governor of Oklahoma, which is a Republican, the Republicans run the state of Oklahoma at the state level. So Oklahoma, like many states, the governor gets to decide when the special election is, or the election for these things are. And oftentimes, if you're in a Democratic state, you'll see that the Democrat governors put them on with other, general elections, the November elections. But the Republicans do not do that, because they don't want high turnout in these things where the people are trying to pass things. They're trying to bypass the state legislature in Oklahoma because they're not going to raise the minimum wage. So he sets this election in the middle of June 16th, where, lots of people are on vacation or just not paying attention to politics, right? But this is when he scheduled it. So the people in the state of Oklahoma had a chance to raise their minimum wage, which is $7.25 an hour right now, up to $15 by 2029. So this is the one where you'll see this is very common where states raise their minimum wages. They don't do it all at once. It doesn't go from $7.25 to $15 overnight. There's incremental steps involved. And in this particular case, the minimum wage would go up to $12 on January 1st. But the people in Oklahoma voted against it. Now, as I recall, this is like the second state, I think, that has voted a minimum wage increase down. Only the second one. Even Republican states in the past have voted to raise their minimum wage, but not Oklahoma. They decided they're not going to do it. And, and it wasn't even that close. It wasn't like it was, 51-49 or something like that. It was 55.4 to 44.6. So we'll just call it a 10-point defeat for the people who wanted to raise the minimum wage. So, it wasn't even that close of an election. So the people in Oklahoma, at least those people that voted, denied themselves a raise in the minimum wage. So just think about that for a second here. The people had a chance to give themselves a raise in their minimum wage, and they voted no, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But the problem that you see lots of times is money in politics. I've talked about that a number of times on this show, and this was no different, where you had the Republican Party, you had the big businesses, right? They're all out there advertising like, oh, you don't want to raise the minimum wage because there's small businesses are going to close and there's going to be job loss and we can't afford this and, blah, blah, blah. Prices are going to go up. That's the usual arguments that they make all the time. And funny how it turns out that none of them work. Like, yeah, there's a few job losses, but it's nothing like they say that's going to happen. There's not a horde of small businesses closing in states that have raised their minimum wage. There might be some, but nothing like they claim that there's going to be. And all of these, Republican states, let alone the Democratic states, but I'll just use the Republican states that have passed the minimum wage increases, none of them have gone broke, right? None of them have collapsed because they raised their minimum wage. So to remind people, this is what you make on minimum wage if you work 40 hours a week, so a full-time job. So you take $725 times 40 hours times 52 weeks in a year. So if you do that multiplication, you end up with $15,080. Now that number is before any taxes are taken out of your paychecks. Now imagine, can you live rather on $15,000 a year? A lot of people can't, but apparently they can in Oklahoma, where, the people voted this down. So this is something that I ask in my classes all the time, is like, we go through the math and then I ask them, well, how, is this something that you're able to live on? And hardly any of them say no. And most of these are high school kids, by the way. And then I go through and I say, well, how much is rent and how much is your electric bill and, food and all this sort of stuff. And they can see how, in many cases, they're in the hole by the end of the month. And this is, I guess, is how people expect people to live in Oklahoma now. By the way, that $15,080, that is under the 2026 federal poverty guidelines, which is $15,960 for one person. So even if you work full-time getting the minimum wage, you're still in poverty in the United States of America. So apparently the people in Oklahoma decided to keep the people of Oklahoma, at least the ones that are getting minimum wage, in poverty. I guess that's fine with them. You hear all the time where Republicans complain about, oh, there's all these, lazy people getting government benefits and blah, blah, blah. Well, here was your chance to get them out of poverty, by raising the minimum wage. But no, couldn't do it. So now you're going to have people still getting public benefits, still, your tax dollars that you complain about are going to these people are still going to go to those people. You had a chance to get them out of poverty, but you said no. So I looked at some of the estimates for how many people this would affect in Oklahoma. So about 12,000 people in Oklahoma make the minimum wage. So if you would have raised that, they would have got out of poverty, at least over the poverty guideline. And then I looked further into, okay, how many people make under $15 an hour? Because that was, the highest that it was going to get raised up to, and that's the common number these days. And that was around, roughly 350,000 people in the state of Oklahoma make under $15 an hour, which is about 20% of the workforce in the state itself. Well, now you just denied those people, from getting a wage increase as well. So you might be asking yourself, well, why do people vote this way? Why did they decide to keep people in poverty and pay them less money? Well, part of it is, with all the the ads and everything else, people have been indoctrinated into poverty, meaning they're fine with people being in poverty. It's kind of an expectation for people in the eyes of other people. I mean, they believe that that's what the other people deserve. They want to look down at other people because it makes them feel more important. Even if they're not making $15 an hour, they're still like, well, those people are still making less than I am, so it's okay. Right? People are okay with you doing good as long as it's not as good as you're doing, right? It's like, that's what a lot of people feel like, and I suspect that's a lot of the reasoning why this got voted down in the state of Oklahoma. Again, most states vote to raise it, but not Oklahoma. So the business community, of course, and the rich people were out there doing their typical scaremongering about small businesses closing and prices are going to go up and jobs will be lost and the government shouldn't, force wages. It should be the, market. These are all ideas that have been debunked in various recent studies that have been done on what has happened when the minimum wage has increased. And by the way, in 2009 is when the federal minimum wage was up to $7.25. So that's been like 17 years ago. Prices have certainly gone up since 2009, right? We're not paying 2009 prices for stuff. So this whole argument about, well, prices are going to go up. Well, yeah, they already are. I mean, this is how our economy works. Rightly or wrongly, but that's just the way it works. So this argument about, well, prices are going to go up. Well, they already are. That's why you're asking for more of a minimum wage. I mean, this whole claim is just bogus. I mean, prices go up for all kinds of reasons. So, again, these studies show, yeah, prices could go up a little bit. There could be a few job losses, right? There may be a few small businesses closed, but it's certainly not at the scale that these millionaires and the rich business community want you to believe, or Republicans want you to believe. But yet a lot of people in Oklahoma apparently bought that argument, and they denied themselves an increase in the minimum wage. It's just another way to take advantage of workers so that they stay poor and that your business gets to keep more money. Maybe your business isn't so great if you can't, pay more than poverty wages to your workers. So it's, prices have gone up since 2009. The minimum wage hasn't. I mean, that's pretty simple math to figure out what's going to happen to your budget if you are one of those people getting paid that. Plus, if the minimum wage goes up, you know what happens to other people's wages? They go up too. So apparently your desire to keep those poor people poor is, made it so like this is how how you decide to vote on it. I guess that's more important to you, is keep them people poor. And if you look at 2009, when you adjust for inflation since then, the minimum wage now is worth 30% less than in 2009. Because your purchasing power for the same amount of money has dropped 30% since 2009. But Oklahoma thinks it's okay for the poorest people to still make that same wage 17 years later. Predictably, the president of the Chamber of Commerce in Oklahoma came out and said, well, voters chose to protect Oklahoma's economic momentum and one of our greatest competitive advantages, affordability. How is keeping minimum wage so low protecting your economic momentum? That doesn't make much sense. By the way, the GDP of Oklahoma is 30th in the United States, so I would hardly be bragging that you have economic momentum when you're 30th out of 50 in the United States. But hey, you can make that claim, I guess. And by the way, Oklahoma ranks as the 6th to 8th poorest state in the United States. Well, I guess they're going to keep being there. Their poverty rate hovers around 15%, which is higher than the national average of 12%. But hey, I guess that's all in the name of affordability. Yeah, right. Well, and not to mention that their K through 12 education system ranks either 49th or 50th, last in the country. And people wonder why income and wealth inequality is so bad in the United States. Well, this is just another example of, policies that certainly contribute to that. But, these arguments are made all over the country, and states that have increased their minimum wage, they haven't fallen apart because of it. It actually puts more money into the local economy when you pay people more. They will spend more money in your local economy. But no, we can't do that in Oklahoma. Guess what, Republicans in Oklahoma? The businesses will continue to raise prices anyway. The rent is going to go up anyway. Utilities are going to go up anyway. And, all you did is make sure that to make it worse for the poorest in your state. And ultimately on yourselves. You're just helping the rich get richer. So, good job, I guess, apparently, in Oklahoma. So here's another example of how Republicans just don't hate poor people, but they hate kids too. Now you're probably saying, oh, come on, Bruce, hate's a strong word. Well, yeah, but, again, you look at their policies. You don't go with what Republicans say. Go with what their policies are, what they pass in the laws, and how those laws affect us. So Republicans love to claim they're pro-family. We're pro-kids. Right? But you got to go beyond these talking points. You got to look at the impact of their policies. So I'm going to be talking about SNAP cuts. So I've covered that before on the show. Now there's some studies that have come out, 2 separate ones, showing that so far, at least, the effect of SNAP cuts on 12 states. Okay, they've gotten data from 12 states. So the data that I'm going to talk about here is just on 12 states, not on 50, but just 12. So these studies show that 770,000 children have lost their SNAP benefits already. And that's just in 12 states. Now, if 12 is, roughly a quarter of 50 states. So if you take that 770,000, you multiply it by 4, just to extrapolate here, if you get similar numbers for the rest of the country, that's over 3 million kids are going to lose their SNAP benefits. But, the Republican Party, they're pro-family and pro-life and pro-kids. Sure they are. Of course, I pointed out on earlier shows when they were debating this bill, this is part of the big, horrible bill that was passed last year, right? Republicans claimed, well, we're just going to go after the waste, fraud, and abuse here. We're going to, needy people are still going to get their food stamps. We're going to, restore integrity to the system and ensure that it works for the most vulnerable among us. This was the chair of the House Ag Committee that deals with the SNAP program. Baloney, you know what was going to happen when you pass this. I mean, this is not a big secret that people are going to get kicked off. Well, so far in just 12 states, 770,000 children have lost their benefits. Now, if you look at those 12 states, everybody who's lost their benefits, that's 1,670,011 people are no longer receiving benefits in those 12 states. So of that number, 776,134, or roughly 46%, were kids. Arizona is the state with the largest decline, where they lost 205,223 kids since July of 2025. Mikey Johnson, Mikey J as I call him, the current House Speaker of the House, his state of Louisiana is second. They had 22% decline in children's benefits. So if you compare February of 2025 to February of 2026, according to the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture data, 4.3 million fewer people received SNAP benefits between that year period of time. And this number is only going to get higher because starting in October of this year, states are going to have to start paying 75, so 75 or 3/4, 75% of the program's administrative costs. Currently, they're paying 50. Well, the big horrible bill raised that up to 75%. How many states, have really budgeted for that? Not many, if any. Plus, on top of that, starting in October of 2027, states are also going to have to pay more of the benefits themselves because depending on what their error rates are, meaning, when they get audited, they find that some mistakes were made for overpayments or underpayments that occur in the system. So let's say if states have an error rate of 8%, well, they're going to have to pay 8% of the benefit amounts as well. So, certainly there's some, everyone, you will find fraud in food stamps like you do with any program, not just any government program, but any program. There's going to be some fraud involved. But even the USDA has said that many of the errors involved in specifically the SNAP program are largely unintentional. But now the states are going to have to start paying more for these unintentional mistakes that are made based on their error rates. So many states will have staffing shortages and have a hard time complying with these new regulations, increasing the likelihood of families falling through the cracks. And you see this with the Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, who was asked, well, what about these 770,000 kids being kicked off? She's like, oh, that number's not right. Contending that most people, kicked off were fraudulent. Then she claimed that the studies were done by Democratic leading groups, so you can't trust them. The old fake news response. Yeah, okay, Brooke, but by your own logic, then we don't have to believe your numbers or your claims about fraud either, the Republican administration's claims. We don't need to believe that then, if we follow your logic. And I've said before on the show, I don't follow them. I don't believe them anyway. So this is going to be a public health crisis in the making. I mean, it already is. We know what happens to kids when they're not being fed. More sickness, worse academic outcomes, more mental health problems. And the Republicans seem to forget this. Or they're fine with it, apparently. With all the kids that are being kicked off, these expenses are going to go up too. And that means we the taxpayers, are going to be spending more money on these preventable outcomes. But apparently that doesn't matter to the Republicans. And let's not forget, this is all over $6 a day. That's what the benefits are for the SNAP program per day is $6. Compare that to the Pentagon budget, which spends roughly $3 billion with a B, $3 billion a day. But boy, we can keep raising that, but oh my God, we can't keep people on when it's $6 a day. Let's go starve some kids. That's what the Republicans are doing. And I don't have to tell you, food shelves are running low, the prices of food is going up, but we can't pay $6 a day to keep the kids from starving. And then, let's not forget, they did this so that they could do these big tax cuts for the rich people. This is what voting for Republicans get you. So all you Republican voters, I guess you support starving kids. Now, a lot of them are going to say, well, no, I don't. No, I don't. Well, yeah, you do. You can't deny these outcomes. This is what happens. You can't have it both ways. This is what Republican policies do to poor people. Now the Republicans are telling kids, apparently, to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Right? That's one of their favorite lines. I guess the cruelty is the point here. And boy, are they Republicans sure showing that with these policies. All right, when we come back, I'm going to talk about some signs that our democracy is not working so well. So we'll do that on the other side of the break here on the Politics Matter Show. All right, welcome back to the Politics Matter Show, how civics, politics, and law affect you. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning in. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about signs that our democracy is breaking down. And of course, this is the whole goal of the Republican Party. Right. So I just thought I would go through some of them. This list that I'm going to be giving you is not by any means the only ones. There's certainly a lot more. But just to give you an idea about how bad things are getting and why, again, it's important that you realize how politics affects you personally, and that, if you want to keep democracy, you got to get out there and at least vote in the November election. So the first one is, and I think this is a pretty, one of the bigger reasons why democracy is breaking here in the United States, is that citizens stop paying attention. Right? I mean, maybe you found yourself thinking this, the same way every now and then. It's like, politics doesn't really matter to me. It doesn't really affect me all that much. Or, it's too complicated, so I'm not going to do a whole lot with it. Or, I just can't talk to other people about, politics because they get mad at me and they yell at me and I just don't like it. So I'm just going to avoid it. And then you end up, not voting and you're just not involved. And, this is what happens with prior democracies, where this is probably one of the big reasons why democracy has died in some other countries, is because the people just stopped participating. Right? They made decisions that this just isn't for me, and so I'll leave it to somebody else. Well, if you leave it to somebody else, look what's happening. Right? So a lot of people look at politics, and I talk to my classes about this in political science, is that too many people just want to be entertained. Right? We all know about how short our attention span is and how everybody's looking at their phones or their iPads or whatever it is. Right? They just get distracted way too easily. So this gets back to politics is just too complicated. I just can't follow it. Well, actually, it's not that complicated, really, when you sit down and look at stuff, what's going on. Like my definition of politics is pretty simple. Power plus money. That's it. The fight over power, the fight over money. This is what's going on most of the time when you're talking about politics. But, the people, for whatever reason, lots of people have their own reasons. They just stop paying attention. And the founding fathers, one of the things that they talked about after they passed the Constitution was, the people have to be involved. The people have to keep being educated, because ultimately the people have the power and they can rule themselves, if we stay engaged. Well, these days there's just far too many people not engaged. And the second thing is rules started bending before they broke, and now there's just a lot of them that are broken. I mean, I've been talking about how the Trump administration is just breaking all kinds of norms. I mean, let alone bending them, but they're actually breaking them. And the system is not built for that. The system is built that the people would keep people in line. Like when they started seeing rules being bent, that they would put a stop to it. Well, that's not happening these days. And now a lot of these rules are being not only bent, but they're being broken. And then when that happens, people get used to it. Everybody just moves on from it. They're like, well, this happens. And, these days at least, nothing really happens to those who break the rules or the norms. Right? Nothing's really happening to Trump other than, the Supreme Court gave him immunity. But, and I'll get to the Supreme Court here in a bit. But, when the politicians understand they don't really need to follow the rules anymore, they're not going to get, beaten in an election, or they're not going to get charged with crimes or, whatever. You're just giving them more incentives to break rules. And that's certainly what's going on these days. People just start ignoring the norms that we had in our, system, and they try and make them into worse ones. So actually now breaking the system is like the new normal, unfortunately. Third one is loyalty moves from institutions to just one man. Boy, does that sound familiar these days, right? Where Congress and the Supreme Court are basically letting Trump do whatever the hell he wants. Supreme Court has given him presidential immunity, as long as it relates to his job somehow, right? When Biden was in charge, the Merrick Garland fumbled the ball, and he should have went after a bunch of different people, and but he didn't. And now we're stuck in the situation that we are in these days, where at least if the Republicans are in charge and they just do whatever Trump wants to do. Now, hopefully they will start changing that when they realize they're going to get crushed in the midterms, where they could lose the House and they could lose the Senate. Now, they're probably going to lose the House, even though they're cheating to try and keep it. But they might lose the Senate, too. So you might start seeing some Republicans, like, going away from him as the midterms approach. Another one is that emergency powers stop feeling like emergencies, right? Trump he's running around all the time, and he did this in his first term too, where everything's an emergency. And I have to have emergency powers so that I can deal with these emergencies. When in fact, they're not emergencies. They never have been. And they still aren't. But here again, everybody kind of gets used to everything's being an emergency. And another problem in our system is courts are simply too slow. They need to speed stuff up. They need to get decisions out quicker than what they are. They need to do appeals a lot more faster than they are. So the courts are, kind of enabling what's going on here too, where they just move way too slow. Or in some cases, as I mentioned on previous shows, judges are politicians too. So a lot of Republican judges just are doing what Trump wants them to do. They're fine with it. They're fine with these emergency powers. They're fine with breaking the rules because that's part of their political ideology right now. And they're okay with it. Another one is politics has become a show instead of a job, right? Where this is all relating to, everything is a conflict. Everybody's, my side is right. Your side is wrong. Social media, I blame social media a lot for this one where, people believe stuff that's totally false. Well, it appeared on my social media feed, so it's got to be true. Or my political party put this out, so it's got to be true. Well, no, oftentimes it isn't. But people believe it anyway because that's their bias, right? And another thing lately as well, there hasn't really been any big policy changes, that help the ordinary person. There's been a lot of policy changes that hurt us. Again, that's the point with the Republicans. And they're certainly doing that. But if you look at this from the Democratic point of view, it's like, what real policy changes have been put in place? Not too many. And I think that's part of the problem too, is a lot of people are just like, well, the government doesn't really work for me. It's just a show. Plus, remember how many millionaires are in Congress. So, it's tough. It's tough when they're passing stuff for the rich people, but not for the rest of us. Next one is election manipulation. Or, cheating in elections, if you want to put it that way. Right, where we have gerrymandering galore for the House of Representatives at the federal level and at state House and Senate districts in state legislatures. Right, whichever party is in control of the state, and oftentimes that's Republicans in more states than Democrats, they pass these horrific maps so that, they're going to keep winning. Now, I'm hoping that this midterm election will end up where they really, it's going to backfire on them, at least at the House of Representatives level. We'll see. But, I've said on previous shows too, like in a lot of these races, you already know who's going to win. Unfortunately, you don't have too many competitive races because of the gerrymandering that's involved, where they draw their own line so that their party wins. Right, and then you have the myth of voter ID. There is no voter ID problem. I know the Republicans love to say that there is. They love to say that millions and millions of illegal immigrants are voting. No. Look at the data. There's tons of studies that have been done on this, and it's not a thing. Yeah, every now and then Republicans get caught doing voter fraud, but this is not a thing. No, I'm not saying that there's never any voter fraud in an election. What I'm saying is there's very few, and you don't need to make all these changes. But, I know the Republicans love to go with voter ID because, well, you can buy a bottle of booze. You have to show voter ID. Yeah, well, that's not the same thing as, your right to vote. And as I've said before, why don't Republicans, when they're in charge, give everybody, if they love voter ID, why don't they give everybody a free one? But that's the point. See, they're not going to do that, and they never are going to do that because then it wouldn't make any difference. They know this. But this is just a way to kick people off the voting rolls and to stop them from voting. And they do the old closing the voter places, right? So you end up with longer lines. This is particularly true in minority areas. You don't see this in white areas. Right? You also, there's places that run out of ballots because too many people show up because they don't have enough polling places, right? In the Republican states, they cut early voting. They're trying to get rid of mail-in voting. I mean, all of these things just show you how they're trying to manipulate the elections so that the Republicans will win. Because they know that if it's a free and fair election, they will lose more elections. But they want to stay in power. Getting back to my definition of politics. And then, of course, they're running around. Well, they're still running around saying the 2020 election was rigged. Right now, they're already saying that the 2026 election was rigged, even though they're the ones trying to rig it with the gerrymandering that they're doing and all these voting laws they're changing in these states. So, they're out there arguing all this stuff without any evidence. But, the Republican Party believes this stuff. They just eat it up. They love this stuff because they want to stay in power. Then the last one here that I have on this list is the Supreme Court. Right? They're partisan in their rulings. They favor the minority view of things. Again, if you look at polling on a lot of these issues that they decide, they've ruled in favor of the minority view on things. So majority does not rule in the United States. You know how they're going to decide cases just by the cases that they take. So I've talked about this earlier on this show where when they took up I'll use the abortion case, the Dobbs case as an example. Next day I was in my classes saying, yeah, they're going to overturn Roe versus Wade. Well, how do you know that? I know because when 6 Republicans, right now it's 6-3 in the Supreme Court, they're going to do it. And they did. And you can do this with a lot of their cases. So the other day they came out with a lot of cases that they ruled in favor of big business. I've said before that the Roberts Court is going to go down in history as the biggest supporter of big business ever by their rulings. So when you see cases where there's in one of them, what was it? Exxon Oil. Right now they're going to vote for Exxon Oil's position. And they did. So, despite John Roberts' claim that, we don't do partisan rulings. Yeah, you do. You do. And it's becoming more and more obvious to people that you're doing it. All right, so we're going to take our next break here. And when we come back, I'm going to talk, I try to talk about some good news. So I'm going to do that next here on the Politics Matter Show. All right, welcome back to the Politics Matter Show. I'm Bruce Klopfleisch, your host. Thanks for tuning in and supporting the show and the station. So I'm taping this Wednesday morning again, like I usually do. So last night, again, Tuesday night, there were some primaries. in, I think, like 4 states around the country. So, but specifically, I'm going to talk about New York. Okay, so there were a lot of people watching how these primaries are going to turn out in New York because of the mayor, Zoran Mamdani, who endorsed a number of people in those elections, both at the state level and at the federal level. So for the federal level, there was 3 in the House of Representatives. So I'll get to those here in a bit. And then there were some that he did for the state legislature in New York. And mainly what his endorsements are for people who were part of the basically the Democratic Socialist Party, not the Democratic establishment, okay, in New York. Or they were, a lot more progressive than the centrist candidate from the Democratic Party. Right, so part of what people were watching is like, well, are these like Democratic Socialists going to win or not? Or, how strong are they going to get even if they lose? I mean, are they going to make races competitive, right? Or not? How are the establishment Democrats going to do in these primaries in New York? So as it turns out now, these numbers may change by Saturday or Sunday when the show airs here. But from what I can find out so far, at least, Mamdani endorsed 10 people in the federal and state elections for New York, and all 10 of them won in the primaries. And some of them won by a lot. I'll get to that here in just a second. So there's a lot of the political pundits out there this morning. Again, I'm taping this Wednesday morning. Talking about how he's a kingmaker now, and a lot of his people, his all the people that he endorsed won, stuff like that. But then, and I'm just waiting for this to happen when you listen to these shows. Particularly the national shows, they always do something like the following. Well, that's just New York City. That's not going to work in Utah or Idaho. Well, of course not. But they're just trying to take away what actually happened. And then they turn to this establishment guy in Utah won, or the establishment person in Maryland won. Yeah. Those are 2 different states than New York. But what's happening here is that these people that won in New York, and again, I'll get to those in just a second, they're going to be in Congress. And those numbers are going to keep growing, I think, over time. And I'll talk a little bit about why here in this segment here. But so Mamdani endorsed 3 people for Congress. So for the House of Representatives. And these people were running against incumbents in 2 of the races. The third race was an open seat. So the current person, she retired, but her son ran, and her son lost. So if you go by that, it's almost like 3 incumbents lost. 3 out of the 3 lost. So, his Democratic Socialist Party people won. They beat the incumbents. Now, one of those was I want to say between 3 or 4%. So that was a close one. The person that lost was the head of the Hispanic caucus, currently in Congress, but he lost. And then Dan Goldman lost, I think in large part because he was too much of an establishment Democrat, and he was pro-Israel. And I think a lot of people in New York City didn't like that, in his area at least, and voted against him for that reason. So there's 2 incumbents that are out now for the Democrats in New York City. And these places are blue seats. So, Republicans aren't going to beat these people in the general election. So you're going to get more Democratic Socialists in the House of Representatives. And then the other people that he endorsed, they're gonna probably go on to win in the state legislature. So there's going to be more at the state level as well. And this is on the heels of Washington, D.C. The person who won the primary there for mayor is a Democratic Socialist. So why are we seeing all this stuff? All these Democratic Socialists winning? Well, I think it gets back to what I've talked about numerous times on this show, is that the base of the Democratic Party is changing. Right? We don't like these centrists who aren't doing much. Right? They're not fighting very hard for us. They're not fighting for our values. They're there, but what are they actually doing? And yeah, they don't have power, but they're not even fighting to try and get more. A lot of them. And the base wants new blood. Right? They want some younger people in there fighting for us. Because the current crop of Democrats just isn't doing enough. And let's not forget, with a lot of these, older Democrats, Trump beat us twice, right? You want to be bragging? You can't brag about that. Let's be clear here. We need new people because Trump beat us twice. The people at the DNC, and I hate to say bad words about Ken Martin, but geez, what are you people doing? The base is changing, you got to change with it. And these candidates, and you'll see more and more of them across the country, I'm pretty sure. If not now, at least in 2028, you're going to see more of them running. And I think another big part of this is policies actually matter now. Right? And this is something that the pundits don't get. They love to say, well, they're a Democratic Socialist and they won and blah, blah, blah. But I was listening to like a couple of them before doing the show here, and not one of them brought up the policies that they support. Right? This is what I think the punditry is missing, is that the actual policies that these Democratic Socialist candidates are running on is what the people want. It's what the base wants. And it's not just going to be happening in New York City. It's going to be happening all over the country. The base is simply dissatisfied with the establishment now. And you're starting to see this happening here. And I think you're going to see it happening more and more across the country. All right, so thanks for tuning in this week. We will talk to you next week here on the Politics Matter Show.